Hey guys, what's going on? It's your favorite seer of the world, Spirit. And yeah, today I want to talk about um my reading of Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. Um and I guess it's kind of hard to encapsulate, kind of like, for example, Kant's critique of pure reason or even the prolegomena to any future metaphysics, which I had to read for grad school, and there's some stuff in there that I still don't quite understand. Same thing for the phenomenology of spirit, but I'm gonna try. It's basically a book about how ideas influence the course of human events. Notice I didn't say history. We'll get to that later. Um but yeah, I'm using uh this edition right here, translated by A.V. Miller. This is the Oxford University Press edition. I feel like this translation is pretty standard for English. Like, if you look at a lot of like philosophy memes, even this is the edition that's usually in the memes. Um and yeah, guys, what can I say? I was a bit of a Hegel hater, to be honest with you. Um, like, especially because I'm very partial to more of the existential side of philosophy, like Kierkegaard, Camus, um, Nietzsche, and stuff like that. Although I know that's controversial. Some people I've heard argue that Nietzsche is not actually an existentialist. Uh, but I do think his ethics is pretty existential. Um, and we'll also get to that later. But come to find out, like, a lot of these people used ideas very, very, very similarly to Hegel. In fact, I mean, I'm pretty sure some of it is just copied. Like, for example, the master and bondsman relation, which Hegel talks about as, you know, as the great man who forces his will on others and history itself and changes the course of things, and who recognizes himself as an agent in such a way that he's able to like buff traditions and stuff like that. um when this came out, the most recent person to do that was, of course, Napoleon, your boy. Nah, but that's obviously really, really similar, although not exactly the same, right? Because it's not necessarily just a moral relation to Nietzsche's master servant morality, right? And then um he says something very similar also, and I even wrote down where it was exactly because it struck me so much. Section 22, he says something to the effect of, the self is that same self relation which relates itself to itself. And further down, I forget which section exactly, he says that that self also necessarily must relate itself to another. And I'm like, oh my gosh, he said the thing, bro. That's where it came from. Because in The Sickness Unto Death, Kierkegaard, that's like the opening line. He says the self is a relation which relates itself to itself, and in relating itself to itself, relates itself to another. Um, and he basically, um, combined Hegel's two separate declarations into one statement. Now, of course, again, it's different for Hegel. That relation uh to itself doesn't really go beyond the the individual and his relations to society. I mean, he does talk about the like revealed religion and stuff like that, but he kind of only, or at least I interpreted it to, yes, he acknowledges what he calls the super sensible world, which is kind of like, it was giving me Plato's um world of form or realm of forms vibes, right? Which for a book about phenomenology is fitting, right? Because like he actually does talk about, for example, like I think he uses the example of sugar cubes. Like when we talk about a thing or when we say it is a thing, we see it as a unity. We don't go out and we list like every single characteristic. We say, "Oh, that's a sugar cube." And then if someone asks us, then if we relate ourselves to another and not just to the private language, which we can also use in public, right? But the private language that we have in our interior. Um for some it's a voice, for others it's not. Some people don't have a voice, but they have a just an interior understanding, like, oh yeah, that's a sugar cube. Um um then we get into the realm of a public language. We're like, yeah, that white sugar cube right over there. And we may point to it. But also again, depending on things like culture or angle or lighting, your white may not be the same as my white. And he does kind of make that point also. I think he uses the example of like two people looking at a building, but one is at a slightly different angle and it's kind of obstructed by a tree. They're going to interpret and describe what that building looks like because of their perspective. And I'm like, dang, bro, that's another thing. You get a proto, like, perspectivalism. Once again, just like Nietzsche, man. And, it's, I'm just, again, it's always like, wow, here's another thing. And then I realized, like, wow, Hegel might actually be one of the goats. Um, but also, um, going back to the self, um, I think Hegel offers a like super important phenomenological critique of Aristotle, guys, because Aristotle, in my opinion, and I made this point kind of in my video which I made about his critique of physiognomy and and stuff like that, where you know, hey, Aristotle, if you know basic Western philosophy, has its four causes, and the last one is the final cause or the purpose, the telos. Um, and he says that this isn't right because while something like telos might work for inanimate objects or animals who are a lot more, reactive to humans, like if you can more easily train a dog to do the same thing over and over and over again. Whereas humans, even though Aristotle claims that, our end is, necessarily or should necessarily be virtue in his way of the golden mean, trying to strike a balance and stuff like that, which I feel like most people have heard of. Um, I feel like a lot of my viewers will probably be eudaimonia pilled as well, um, but the problem with that is that that's not really the way humans actually operate, right? Like, we can be very irrational and very reactive, and a lot of the times, reason doesn't come to save us. It a lot of the times, and this is why a lot of smart people aren't maybe necessarily all that smart, and it's not automatically a good thing, but like, reason can be used to justify a lot of terrible stuff, and very well and very consistently, um even. And sometimes we need to go past, excuse me, the golden mean, right? And so Hegel's critique ultimately comes down to um the fact that Aristotle doesn't allow room for the human subject, for that relation which is a relation which relates itself to itself and relates itself to another, which basically means that we can change, and we are changed by our environment and others, right? And you know that to me is Hegel's sort of like quintessential contribution to Western society, or I'm sorry, Western philosophy, right? That, like, because before this point, it was kind of, following Aquinas and a few others. It's like, well, it's God's plan. And Hegel does kind of acknowledge God's plan in kind of a Thomistic way, like, that, like, ultimately, yeah, I mean, he knows all, but at the same time, like, I don't know, he follows the kind of enlightenment process of saying, but still, again, that may just be like God experiencing himself, which is, that kind of sounds like Ibn al Arabi, not gonna lie. Or at least that's the way I interpreted it. Maybe I'm wrong. Like I say, guys, this is just me rambling. And so by the end, and spoilers kind of, he gets all the way to the notion of history, right? Um, where, he says that history, because it's necessarily a human thing and a human way of organizing events, he says that it's a very similar way of relating the actions and ideas of humans to things that happened in the past, and that also changes with time, which is another. I mean, it sounds so basic, but if you know history, if you like history, that's called historiography. Right? And the way we see history is constantly changing. It's constantly being put into different perspectives. And sometimes deliberately so, other times not deliberately so. But I'll give you an example from my childhood. I grew up in the South, Western Florida. Um and you know, being that it was part of the Confederacy, I was taught that the Civil War was about states' rights. Um, which, is part of this wider myth called the Lost Cause that tries to pretend like it wasn't primarily about the servitude and bondage of uh African descended peoples in this country, which it kind of. There were a few other sub reasons, of course, but it's like the lost cause myth is built around that, and it's still um pretty prominent just in the like regular discourse of the South, unfortunately. When, like, yeah, guys, that's what I was taught. It wasn't until I moved more up north, although technically still geographically in the South, where I started learning the actual history and like how people fought, and how it was primarily driven by the issue of servitude. I can't say the other word. I wish I could, but YouTube will age restrict this, I think, if I say that, so I can't. But yeah, and so history does also, because this changing human self that we have is able to be changed, also goes through those processes. Um and so yeah, bro, I'm guys, I didn't understand everything from the book. I don't think someone who claims to completely understand Hegel is telling the truth. Just like the same with Kant. Even if you have like a PhD or whatever, right? Like, I don't think philosophy is ever settled, nor is the history of philosophy. But I'm still just kind of blown away by this stuff, and like, I regret being such a Hegel hater in my youth and never actually, sitting down to read him until now, because he's great. And I'm actually reading Das Kapital now, so uh, we'll see about that. I'm gonna try and read all 3 volumes these next few months. Wish me luck. Bye. See you guys.